If you've ever built something with your bare hands out of pure love for someone else, then stayed up past 3 in the morning because you refused to let that love go to waste, you need to watch this until the very last second. What happened to Daniel Reyes should never happen to anyone, and by the time you reach the end of this story, you will understand exactly why. Before we go further, if stories about ordinary people rising against powerful men speak to you, hit like right now and subscribe to the channel because we bring you a new true-to-life story every single week, and you will not want to miss what comes next. Daniel Reyes was 34 years old, and for the last 3 of those years, he had been both mother and father to his daughter Mia. His wife Sarah had died in a car accident on a rainy October night, leaving behind a half-finished nursery rhyme book, a closet full of unworn dresses, and a little girl who still reached for 2 hands when she crossed the street, even though only one was ever there now. At night, after Mia was asleep, he went down to the garage, flipped on a single hanging bulb, and worked on something that had nothing to do with his day job and everything to do with his future. It started as a way to lower the electric bill. Their old house leaked heat like a sieve, and every winter the furnace fought a losing battle against drafty windows and a thin attic. Daniel began sketching a small home energy management unit, a device that could learn a household's patterns, redirect stored solar and grid power intelligently, and cut costs by nearly 40%. He called it ClearGrid. It began as scrap circuit boards and secondhand sensors bought off classifieds, but slowly, month after month, it became something real. He filmed every late-night session on an old phone propped against a paint can, not for social media, but because his engineering professor back in college had taught him one rule that he never forgot. Document everything, because someday somebody will ask you to prove it was yours. 2 years into building ClearGrid in his garage, Daniel got the call that seemed, at the time, like the answer to every prayer he had whispered over Mia's bed. Whitcomb Dynamics, one of the fastest-growing clean energy companies in the country, was hiring contract engineers for a new consumer hardware division. The man behind the company, Gregory Whitcomb, was something of a legend in the industry. Young, charismatic, always photographed in perfectly tailored Navy suits. Always quoted saying things like, "Innovation belongs to those bold enough to act on it." Daniel told himself this was a chance to finally get ClearGrid the resources it needed. He did not know yet that Gregory Whitcomb collected other people's boldness the way some men collect watches. Daniel's first week at Whitcomb Dynamics was a blur of key cards, non-disclosure agreements, and hallway introductions. He was assigned to a small hardware innovation team under a woman named Priya Nair, a sharp, no-nonsense lead engineer who had been with the company for 6 years and had learned, the hard way, to keep her best ideas close to her chest. On his second week, during an all-hands innovation showcase where junior engineers were invited to pitch personal projects for possible internal funding, Daniel made the biggest mistake of his professional life. He brought a working prototype of ClearGrid to the office, plugged it in, and let it speak for itself. The room went quiet in that particular way that means something important just happened. Gregory Whitcomb, who rarely attended these low-level showcases, happened to be in the building that day for an investor call, and he wandered in for the last 10 minutes. He watched Daniel's little gray box hum to life, watched the live dashboard redirect power in real time, and watched 40% shave itself off a simulated bill right there on the screen. He said only one sentence to Daniel that day: "Send me everything you have on this by Friday." Daniel, exhausted and hopeful and desperate for validation, did exactly that. He sent his schematics, his testing logs, and even some of the garage footage, believing he was finally being seen. For 3 weeks, nothing happened, and Daniel told himself that was normal, that big companies move slowly, that patience was part of the process. Then, on a Tuesday morning that started like any other, Daniel was called into a small glass conference room by an HR representative he had never spoken to before. She slid a single piece of paper across the table. It was a termination notice citing restructuring of the contract hardware division effective immediately. Daniel asked, voice cracking despite his best effort to stay composed. What had happened to ClearGrid? What had happened to the meeting Gregory had promised him? The HR representative simply said she had no information about any project by that name and escorted him out of the building within the hour, his badge deactivated before he even reached the parking lot. 6 weeks later, Daniel was sitting on his couch with Mia asleep against his shoulder, scrolling through his phone out of habit more than curiosity, when a tech news notification stopped his thumb cold. Whitcomb Dynamics had just unveiled its newest consumer product at a glittering press event in San Francisco. It was called NovaCharge. The company's marketing described it as a revolutionary home energy brain, capable of learning your household's rhythms and slashing energy costs by up to 40%. Daniel stared at the promotional video for a long, silent minute. The interface animation, the 4-color LED indicator, the exact phrase household rhythms. It was ClearGrid, wearing a more expensive jacket, standing on a stage that should have been his. Daniel did not sleep that night. He sat at his kitchen table with every notebook, every backup drive, and every scrap of documentation he had ever made, spreading them out like a man trying to reassemble his own stolen reflection. He had the garage footage, dated and timestamped from before he had ever set foot inside Whitcomb Dynamics. He had purchase receipts for components bought 2 full years before his employment began. He had a private engineering forum where he had posted early sketches of the concept, complete with public timestamps, back when he was simply looking for feedback from strangers who loved circuits as much as he did. What he did not have was money for a lawyer, confidence that anyone would believe a laid-off contractor over a famous CEO, or the faintest idea of where to even begin. It was Priya Nair who reached out first. She had seen the NovaCharge launch too, and she had recognized the dashboard layout immediately, because she had sat 2 desks away from Daniel during his brief weeks on the team. She messaged him late one night, careful and quiet, telling him she couldn't say much without risking her own job, but that she still had internal design review emails from before his termination, emails that referenced the Reyes concept by name and project planning documents. She told Daniel that if he was ever brave enough to fight this, she would testify to what she knew, because she had watched this happen to other engineers before him and had always regretted staying silent. Daniel spent the next month living 2 lives at once. By day, he took whatever short-term electrical contracting work he could find to keep the lights on and Mia in her after-school program. By night, he taught himself the basics of intellectual property law from library books and free legal aid webinars, slowly building a timeline of every conversation, every file transfer, every meeting invite connected to ClearGrid. He reached out to a small nonprofit legal clinic that specialized in helping independent inventors, and a young attorney named Rosa Delgado agreed to take his case on contingency, moved less by the size of the potential payout and more by the stack of dated garage videos Daniel showed her during their first meeting. The early months of the legal fight were brutal and mostly invisible to the outside world. Whitcomb Dynamics' legal team, easily 10 times the size of Rosa's entire firm, buried them in procedural filings, demanded impossible deadlines, and offered Daniel a quiet settlement so small it wouldn't have covered a year of Mia's future college fund, on the condition that he sign away any future claim and never speak publicly about ClearGrid again. Daniel wanted, more than almost anything, to take it. He was tired. He was scared. He looked at Mia doing her homework at the kitchen table beside the very same notebooks that held his evidence, and for one long weekend, he almost called Rosa to say yes. What stopped him was a conversation with Mia herself, who had no idea about lawsuits or patents, but who asked him, out of nowhere while they built a paper circuit for her science fair project, why grown-ups sometimes let people get away with taking things that weren't theirs. Daniel didn't have a clean answer for her that night, and the fact that he didn't have one bothered him more than any legal filing ever could. He called Rosa the next morning not to accept the settlement, but to ask her what it would take to go all the way. While Daniel and Rosa built their case quietly, NovaCharge became one of the fastest-selling home hardware products in the country. Whitcomb Dynamics' stock climbed nearly 60% in 4 months. Gregory Whitcomb appeared on magazine covers holding the very device that had once hummed to life on a folding table in a suburban garage. Investors called him a visionary. Industry analysts called NovaCharge the most important consumer energy product of the decade. Daniel watched all of it from the outside, working double shifts, filing paperwork by lamplight, and telling almost no one what he was fighting for, because he could not bear the pitying looks of people who assumed he had already lost. Then, 6 months after the launch, cracks began to show, and not metaphorical ones. Reports started surfacing online of NovaCharge units overheating during peak load redirection, a handful of customers posting videos of scorched wall outlets, and one alarming case of a small kitchen fire in Arizona. Daniel recognized the failure pattern instantly, because it was the exact flaw he had solved in his very first prototype 18 months before ever meeting Gregory Whitcomb. His original design used a redundant thermal cutoff switch that added roughly $4 to manufacturing cost. In his testing logs, dated and preserved, he had written a note to himself explaining exactly why that safety switch could never be removed for cost savings, no matter how tempting the margins looked on paper. Rosa saw the opening the moment the news broke and moved faster than Whitcomb Dynamics' legal team expected. She filed a formal disclosure with the Consumer Product Safety Commission, attaching Daniel's original testing documentation showing that the exact defect now causing house fires had already been identified and solved by the true inventor of the underlying technology more than a year before the product ever reached a single customer's home. The filing became public record within days, and within hours of that, a technology journalist named Farah Okonkwo, who had spent years quietly investigating whispers about Whitcomb Dynamics' pattern of aggressive innovation acquisition, published a long-form article connecting every dot Daniel had spent a year and a half assembling in his kitchen. The article did what a year of legal filings alone never could. It gave Daniel's story a human face. It included a photograph, taken with Daniel's permission, of him sitting at that same kitchen table, with Mia doing homework beside him, the same notebook stacked between them that had once nearly become his defeat and instead became his defense. Farah's reporting quoted 3 other former Whitcomb Dynamics contractors, each describing eerily similar experiences: a showcase, a sudden burst of executive interest, a termination within weeks, a product launch months later bearing an unmistakable resemblance to work they had once called their own. Gregory Whitcomb, it turned out, had built an entire pattern of behavior, and Daniel had simply been the one whose paper trail was strong enough to finally break it open. Whitcomb Dynamics' stock dropped nearly 30% in 2 trading days as the CPSC opened a formal safety investigation and 3 class action law firms announced they were exploring litigation on behalf of affected homeowners. The company's board, which had spent years shielding Gregory from any real accountability because his charisma kept investors happy, suddenly found themselves fielding calls from nervous shareholders and a very persistent business press. An emergency board meeting was called. Rosa was invited, for the first time, to present Daniel's full evidence file directly to the board's independent audit committee, something that would have been unthinkable 18 months earlier when Daniel was just a laid-off contractor nobody wanted to believe. The meeting where everything changed happened on a Thursday afternoon in a glass-walled conference room, not unlike the one where Daniel had once been quietly fired. This time, Daniel was in the room himself, sitting beside Rosa, a folder of his original garage footage open on a laptop in front of the board. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. He simply played, in order, 18 months of dated video showing a device evolving from tangled wires on a workbench into the exact product now sitting recalled in warehouses across the country, complete with the safety switch that Whitcomb Dynamics' cost-cutting team had quietly stripped out to protect their margins. Priya Nair's internal emails, finally submitted without fear of retaliation because she had already quietly accepted a position at a competitor months earlier, closed the final gap in the timeline. Gregory Whitcomb was not in that meeting. He had, by then, already been placed on indefinite leave by a board desperate to distance itself from him before regulators and reporters did it for them. Within a month, an internal investigation confirmed what Daniel had known since the night he first watched that press conference video with Mia asleep on his shoulder, that ClearGrid's design, documentation, and even some of its exact interface language had been directly repurposed into NovaCharge without credit, compensation, or consent, and that the safety compromise responsible for the recalled units traced back to a cost-cutting directive Gregory had personally approved over the objections of his own engineering team. The settlement that followed was not the quiet, humiliating buyout Daniel had once nearly accepted out of exhaustion. It included formal, public acknowledgement that Daniel Reyes was the original inventor of the technology behind NovaCharge, full assignment of relevant patents back into Daniel's name, a financial settlement large enough to finally, properly secure Mia's future, and a binding agreement that Whitcomb Dynamics would issue corrected safety disclosures to every affected household at its own expense. Gregory Whitcomb resigned from the company he had built within the week, and separate reporting later confirmed that federal regulators had opened a broader fraud inquiry into his acquisition practices across at least 4 other disputed inventions. Daniel did not go looking for revenge in the aftermath, and he told Farah as much in the one interview he agreed to give once everything was finalized. What he wanted, he said, was simply to build ClearGrid the way he had always imagined it, on his own terms, without anyone else's name attached to his work. With the settlement and the returned patents, he founded a small company of his own, intentionally keeping it lean, deliberately hiring 2 of the other former Whitcomb contractors whose stories Farah had uncovered, engineers who had quietly given up on ever being believed. Priya joined him 6 months later as lead of hardware safety, a role she took, she told him, specifically because she wanted to make sure no company she worked for ever again treated a safety switch as an expense line to be quietly deleted. The relaunched ClearGrid device hit the market almost exactly 2 years after that first quiet showcase demonstration, where everything had gone wrong. It launched without a glittering press conference, without magazine covers, without a single Navy suit in sight. Daniel did the announcement himself from his own garage, the same one with the single hanging bulb, filming it on a slightly better phone but propped, out of habit, against the very same paint can. He didn't talk about lawsuits or CEOs. He talked about Mia, about the winter their furnace nearly failed, about the 2 years of nights he spent teaching himself something he had no business knowing how to build, simply because he refused to let his daughter grow up cold. Mia, 11 now, stood beside him during that video, holding the very first working ClearGrid prototype like it was something sacred, because in every way that mattered, it was. She had grown up watching him get back up, slowly, methodically, one notebook page at a time, refusing every shortcut that asked him to compromise what he knew was true. When a reporter later asked her what she had learned from everything her family had been through, she said something that ended up quoted in half a dozen articles about the case, that the biggest office in the building doesn't automatically belong to the person who deserves it most, and that keeping good records is apparently one of the most powerful things a person can do. Gregory Whitcomb's name faded from magazine covers almost as quickly as it had appeared on them, replaced eventually by quiet legal filings and a settlement of his own with federal regulators that included a lasting ban from serving as an executive officer at any publicly traded company. Whitcomb Dynamics survived under new leadership, chastened and closely monitored, its once celebrated innovation pipeline now subject to mandatory documentation reviews that traced every product back to its true origin, a policy the new board adopted specifically because of what had happened to Daniel Reyes. Daniel still keeps a garage. It's a little nicer now, with proper shelving and a real workbench instead of a folding table, but he still turns on that same single overhead bulb every time he sits down to sketch something new, because he says the light reminds him of where all of it actually started, long before anyone else decided it was worth stealing. He still films everything, out of habit as much as caution, and he still teaches Mia, now at the kitchen table instead of a hospital waiting room, that the truth doesn't need to be loud to be powerful. It just needs to be documented, patient, and unwilling to disappear. If there is one thing this story leaves behind, it is this. The people who try to quietly take credit for someone else's love, labor, and late nights are rarely prepared for how far that person will go to get it back, especially when there is a child at home worth building something honest for. Before the showcase, before the termination, before any of it, there had been the quiet years that most people never see in a story like this. The years that make a man like Daniel who he is. After Sarah died, he had gone back to work 3 weeks later because the mortgage didn't understand grief. And for the first 6 months, he ran on autopilot, warming bottles that Mia was already too old for out of muscle memory, forgetting which drawer held her socks, learning slowly and painfully how to braid hair from a video tutorial paused a dozen times a night. His mother offered more than once to move in and help, and more than once Daniel almost said yes before deciding that Mia needed to watch her father learn to carry this alone, so that someday she would know it could be done. The garage became his in that first winter, almost by accident. The furnace broke twice in 4 months, and Daniel, unwilling to spend money he didn't have on a repairman, taught himself just enough about the house's wiring and heating system to patch it together himself. It was during that second repair, flashlight in his teeth, elbow deep in the attic crawl space, that the first real spark of ClearGrid's idea came to him. Not as a business plan, but as a simple, furious question. Why should a family already struggling with everything else also have to lose this much heat through walls nobody had bothered to insulate properly? He carried that question down from the attic and never really put it down again. Mia became, without either of them planning it, his first and most honest engineering critic. She was 6 when he built his first ugly prototype, a tangle of wires held together with electrical tape that buzzed unpleasantly whenever it worked at all, and she told him flatly that it was too loud to sleep near. He laughed for the first time in weeks that night, and then he spent the next month solving a noise problem he hadn't even known was a design requirement until his daughter told him so. By the time she was 8, she had opinions about screen brightness, about button placement, about how the little indicator light shouldn't be blue because blue looked cold, and he genuinely listened to every one of them, because somewhere along the way, ClearGrid had stopped being just his project and had become something they were quietly building together. When Gregory Whitcomb told Daniel to send everything by Friday, Daniel had gone home that night and told Mia they might be moving to a bigger house someday, something he immediately regretted the moment he said it out loud, because he understood even then how badly he wanted this to be true. He remembers sitting on her bed that night, letting her ask a dozen questions about what the new house might look like, privately terrified that he had just made a promise he had no real way of keeping. He thought about that conversation often in the months that followed, especially on the nights when the promised meeting never came, and the silence from Whitcomb Dynamics stretched from days into weeks. The months following his termination were the hardest of Daniel's adult life. Harder in some ways than the year after Sarah died, because grief at least came with people who understood it, while failure of this particular kind came with almost total isolation. He picked up whatever electrical contracting work he could find, wiring garages and fixing breaker panels for cash, always careful to be home before Mia's school let out. He stopped mentioning ClearGrid to most people entirely, tired of the sympathetic head tilts from friends who clearly assumed he was exaggerating his own importance to a company that big. Only Rosa Delgado and, quietly, Priya Nair ever heard the full unfiltered version of what had happened, and for a long stretch of time that felt like a very small and very lonely list. Rosa Delgado, in those early meetings, was more patient with Daniel than she strictly needed to be for a contingency case with uncertain odds. She had grown up watching her own father, a small appliance repairman, get consistently underpaid by contractors who knew he couldn't afford to fight back, and something about Daniel's stack of dated notebooks reminded her exactly why she had gone to law school in the first place. She warned him honestly, more than once, that cases like this rarely moved fast and rarely moved fairly, that Whitcomb Dynamics could afford to bury them in paperwork for years if it chose to, and that he needed to be prepared for a long, unglamorous fight with no guaranteed ending. Daniel told her, each time, that he had already survived worse than paperwork. The recall crisis, when it finally arrived, did not feel like victory to Daniel in the moment it happened, even though it should have. He remembers watching the first news segment about the Arizona kitchen fire with a strange, hollow guilt sitting in his chest, because some small part of him knew immediately that the flaw causing it was the exact one he had already solved, back before any of this started, for $4 extra a unit that nobody at Whitcomb Dynamics had wanted to spend. He spent that night not celebrating an opportunity, but worrying quietly about the family in that Arizona home, grateful only that no one had been badly hurt, and more determined than ever that the truth needed to come out properly, not just for his own sake, but for every household with one of those units still humming in a hallway closet. Farah Okonkwo's investigation, when Daniel finally agreed to speak with her, took nearly 3 additional months to fully verify before a single word of it was published, because Farah refused to run a story this consequential on anything less than airtight documentation. She cross-referenced Daniel's timestamps against Whitcomb Dynamics' own internal calendar exports, obtained legally through the discovery process Rosa had fought hard to secure. She tracked down 2 of the 3 other former contractors independently, without telling either of them Daniel's name first, and was startled by how closely their stories matched his, down to the pattern of a sudden executive showcase appearance followed by termination within a matter of weeks. By the time her article finally published, it was less a single accusation than an unmistakable pattern laid out in exhaustive, undeniable detail. There is one detail Daniel rarely mentions in interviews, though he told it to Farah off the record during their very last conversation before publication. On the night the settlement was finally signed, he didn't take Mia out to celebrate at some expensive restaurant, and he didn't buy anything extravagant to mark the occasion. Instead, the 2 of them drove to the hardware store, bought a fresh bag of solder and a small package of LED indicator lights, and spent the evening exactly the way they had spent so many evenings before everything went wrong. At the same workbench, under the same bulb, building something small and quiet and entirely their own, simply because it felt like the truest way to close the chapter that had cost them so much. If Daniel's story moved you even a little, don't scroll away just yet. Tell us in the comments what part of this hit you hardest, whether it was the garage nights, the boardroom footage, or Mia's question about grown-ups letting people get away with things. Share this video with someone who needs a reminder that quiet persistence can outlast even the loudest, most powerful opponent, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next true story of an ordinary person who refused to back down. We'll see you in the next one.